Spearman, and you're watching African Elements. How is it possible that so many of those clamoring for freedom from British rule in 1776 were slave owners themselves? In this episode, we address the contradiction between black freedom, the Enlightenment, and the American Revolution. Welcome back to African Elements, bringing critical examination of topics on Africana studies from the walls of higher education to the masses. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreon contributors for making this content possible. You can join them at the link below in the description for as little as $1 a month. That gets you access to ad-free content and exclusive videos and materials available only to Patreon members. Otherwise, a like and subscribe would also be hugely appreciated. So, let's jump into the content. In this video, we look at the contradiction between the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, and black freedom. To pay for the 7 Years' War with France, Britain tightened its colonial grip on its American possessions. With the passage of what some colonists referred to as the Intolerable Acts, a powerful Virginia planter and slave owner named George Mason wrote, "Though we are British subjects, we will use every means which heaven hath given us to prevent our becoming its slaves."
What?
Wait, what? So in other words, Mason asserted his freedom to own slaves while simultaneously asserting a limitation on the rights of Britain to enslave him. In order to understand the mental gymnastics necessary to hold such a blatantly contradictory position, we have to look at some of the political and philosophical ideas that permeated during the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Enlightenment was a period that questioned the relationship between God, man, the universe, and government. The invention of the printing press was key to the Enlightenment because it meant that books that were previously available only to a few who held power could now be mass-produced. Books like the Bible. So, the masses were able to finally question simple things that previously they were expected to just accept. For example, was the ruling class placed in power simply because God said? Or can people exercise agency in determining who governs over them? Among folks questioning the relationship between the governors and the governed was an English philosopher by the name of John Locke, who died just a couple of generations before the Revolutionary War. Locke pushed back on the notion that those in power earned their station in life through God's blessing, and that those subject to their power were so subjected because that was God's plan for them. Of course, those in power would say, "Who are you to question God's plan?" In challenging the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, the notion that God has predetermined everyone's fate, be it ruler or slave, heaven or hell, Locke proposed the idea of natural rights. These are freedoms that all men, are born with. Among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Thomas Jefferson obviously borrowed from Locke when he penned the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but according to Locke, these are rights that are endowed to all men by their Creator, or God. So, Locke provided Jefferson the loophole to reconcile the contradiction between his assertion that all men are created equal, while clearly not holding the same view toward the hundreds of slaves he held in bondage. In other words, if God has endowed men with the freedom to pursue life, liberty, and property, then by that reasoning, Thomas Jefferson's pursuit of human property, slaves, is a freedom that's bestowed upon him by God. In Jefferson's reframing of freedom, citizenship, and property, blacks were exempted from citizenship and the freedoms that come with it, because blacks not only didn't own property, blacks were in fact property. Even though not all black folks in that era were slaves, by the Revolutionary War the definition of slavery had been so narrowly defined that blackness and slavery were practically synonymous. I covered that in more detail here, so if you'd like to check that out, be sure to click the link. But as Ibram X. Kendi notes in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, a 1680 pamphlet written by an English priest named Morgan Goodwin criticized racist colonial American planters for making those two words, Negro and slave, synonymous, while white was the general name for Europeans. It's interesting to note, though, that in large part the very folks who were pushing back against the idea that their rulers were endowed their power by God were largely the same people invoking God to justify the enslavement of others. About a third of the framers of the Constitution were slave owners, and all were property-owning white men, so it shouldn't be surprising that citizenship and the freedom that accompanies it was framed in the context of property ownership. In fact, the property qualifications for voting weren't removed universally until the 1830s. So, freedom, citizenship, and property ownership were framed in a sort of circular relationship in which all men have the freedom of pursuit of property. Property is a prerequisite of citizenship, and citizenship in turn carries the freedom to pursue property. The contradiction didn't go entirely unnoticed. Thomas Paine excoriated the elite American colonists in his revolutionary pamphlet Common Sense, in which he angrily asked, with what consistency or decency they complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them, while they hold so many hundreds of thousands in slavery. Right? Samuel Johnson, the most famous writer in London at the time, asked incredulously, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Black folks also took notice and pounced on the revolutionary rhetoric to press their own claims for freedom. Northern black slaves in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut petitioned their colonial or state legislatures for emancipation. In the South, where the British held out the promise of freedom in exchange for military service, black men eagerly fought as loyalists on the British side. That was especially true in the wake of Lord Dunmore's 1775 proclamation offering freedom to all slaves who joined the British. As up to 60,000 black slaves answered Lord Dunmore's call, General George Washington lifted his earlier ban on black enlistees as he came to the realization that success will depend on which side can arm the Negro faster. Black folks themselves challenged post-revolutionary America to live up to its creed of freedom, liberty, and equality by pursuing their own freedom through escape, self-purchase, petitions, and successful lawsuits. As a result, slavery steadily phased out in the northern colonies, starting with Vermont in 1877. Even in the mid-Atlantic states such as Pennsylvania and New York, which abolished slavery in 1780 and 1799 respectively, did so even though they tended to have a greater investment in slavery than the New England states. Eventually, virtually all the northern states had legally abolished slavery by the 1830s. In Massachusetts, by 1783, free black men who paid taxes were extended the right to vote. Why did African Americans' claims of freedom seem to gain more traction in the North as opposed to the South, where property-owning white men saw no contradiction between their own pursuit of property and their denial of liberty to everyone else? The answer is largely an economic one. It's worth noting, though, that the moral compass and the economic compass tend to point in the same direction. In contrast to the southern states, which increasingly turned to slavery to fuel its economic engine, the northern states relied more heavily on wage labor. Why would wage labor be preferable to slave labor? Well, the expense of maintaining a large slave labor force, that is to feed, clothe, and house a large number of slaveholders, doesn't make sense unless you have an economy that requires year-round labor, such as, say, cotton plantation. In the northern states, a more disposable labor force was desired. For example, if all you want a laborer to do is unload a cargo ship, does it really make sense to hold a slave in permanent bondage and to have to provide year-round food, clothing, and housing? Or would you rather pay a small wage, extract the labor you need, and then you never have to see that person again? Disposable wage labor was especially advantageous given the steady supply of white ethnic immigrants to supply the cheap labor needs of the northern elite. You can even have them fight it out amongst themselves to see who will accept the lowest wage. The white northern stance in opposition to slavery was not necessarily an anti-racist stance, though. Both slaveholders and abolitionists held beliefs of black inferiority. Where they differed was in their reasoning as to why black people were inferior. Slaveholders tended to believe that blacks were innately inferior, whereas the pervasive theory among abolitionists was that blacks were made inferior through their condition of slavery. Both slaveholders and abolitionists held racist views, though. To put it succinctly, Northern abolitionists opposed slavery, but didn't necessarily want their children sitting next to black kids in schools. Even while celebrating the genius of poets like Phillis Wheatley or astronomer and mathematician Benjamin Banneker, who helped survey the nation's new capital at Washington, D.C. in 1791, their talents were either dismissed by slaveholders or held as the exception by abolitionists. In other words, it was the cruel illogic of racism. When black people rose, racists either violently knocked them down or ignored them as extraordinary. When black people were down, racists called it their natural or nurtured place and denied any role in knocking them down in the first place. So, while they differed in how they rationalized their racism, the northern states framed the morality of slavery around a different set of economic interests from their southern counterparts. Their often competing interests proved to be a challenge during the United States Constitutional Convention. For a more thorough look at how the Constitutional Convention's failure to address those conflicts eventually led to civil war, check out the video linked here. Or you can check out the entire archive of episodes at africanelements.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to support this content further, there's a link to my Patreon page in the description. I'm Darius Spearman, and until next time,